Would you open a mysterious, dusty book if you knew its pages contained the future, but each page you turn brings that future closer to reality? Tonight, we're diving into the top 3 horror stories compilation. These aren't just your typical ghost tales. They're stories that will make you question the world around you and maybe even yourself. But before we begin, let me ask you this. What would you do if you couldn't trust your own memories? The summer before heading off to college, my friend Camden and I were celebrating our last summer together. We'd grown up together as neighbors, but we were heading off to different colleges. Our plans were about as simple as they can get. There was a blank space in our calendars, a decent sum on our bank accounts, and a gassed-up car. That's it. That first week was insane. Camden had to balance constant calls from his mum with being an absolute beast. He'd be doing cranberry vodka shots one second and calmly describe his breakfast in perfect detail the next. We spent 2 days with his distant relatives in Rochester. He may or may not have made out with his own cousin during a particularly high-stakes truth or dare. I can neither confirm nor deny. A couple of days before heading home, we decided to have a final camping night. We split up for a day to see our families and get some supplies. Then we met up at Lake Atabat. Lake Atabat is a bit of a local secret. We got to know about it from Camden's cousins, who more or less dared us to go there. I mean, they expressly told us not to go there, but we took it as a challenge. It was supposed to be an old fishing lake surrounded by small cabins for rent, but the owners had neglected them for decades. All that was left were these crumbling log cabins and an absolutely stunning beach. I was looking forward to getting some alone time with Camden. We'd been so busy living the high life that we hadn't gotten any time to just chill, to talk about the future and make plans. Maybe we'd go fishing. But when I rolled up to Lake Atabat, Camden was already there, and he wasn't alone. He brought 4 friends to keep the party going. The only one I knew by name was Harris. He'd been an acquaintance hanging at the edge of our social circle for a while. A weird guy who asked a lot of questions, but I also knew that the only reason Camden would invite him would be to get a shot at his older sister. We'd never been formally introduced, but her name was Tammy. She didn't look the part of your average law student. She looked much more at home in a mosh pit in a sweaty basement. Tammy had in turn brought 2 of her sorority friends. The 3 of them were in the process of claiming the least rotten cabin off the beach as Camden and Harris collected firewood. Camden waved me over, calling out everyone to come meet me. My heart sank a little. It was going to be fun, but I would have liked to just spend some time with my friend too. This was quickly turning into something different. I was surrounded by smiles as I was introduced to Tammy, Pam, and Kari. Harris gave me an uncertain wave from the sidelines. Camden wrapped an arm around my neck. "This is my brother right here," he called out. "I'm the pretty one. He's the good one." And just like that, the stage was set. We ended up making a fire by the beach, grilling a few hot dogs and having a couple of beers. Harris wasn't feeling it, and ended up spending most of his time fixing the old floating dock instead. I noticed Kari was giving me a little extra attention. She was a peculiar woman with a long face and almost cartoonishly large eyes, but her confidence and genuine personality was difficult not to like. I ended up talking to her for well over an hour. Harris came back with his hands on his hips, clearing his throat to get some attention. "I need something to tie the tanks with," he said. "The what?" Camden asked. "What are you talking about?" "The barrels, the things that makes the dock float," Harris sighed. "I need something to tie them on." "Just ditch it," Camden frowned. "Come on, sit down, have a snack." "Didn't we say we were going to fix this thing?" Harris snapped back. "Or was that just something you said to keep me busy?" It got awfully quiet. I looked around and pointed to one of the old cabins. "I think I saw a garden hose out back," I said. "You can use that, won't rot." Harris gave his sister and Camden a long look. He shook his head, thanking me under his breath. To Harris's credit, he managed to fix that floating dock. It was big enough for all 6 of us, as long as we stood up. If someone was going to sunbathe on it, we might fit 3 if we crowded a bit. The thing was surprisingly solid. Harris definitely knew a couple of sailors' knots to keep the supports in place. Harris and his sister were polar opposites. While Harris kept to himself, Tammy was taking bikini selfies next to the no diving sign. Pam was off talking to her parents on her phone, while Carrie and I was sitting beachside, dipping our feet in the warm water. The sun was setting in about an hour or so, covering the lake in a golden glow. It was going to be a great night, I could tell. We all went out on the floating dock, Tammy and Camden sitting side by side at the edge, kicking us out into the lake. We were cheering, teasing, laughing. All the things you're supposed to do when you're young and curious. We went out on the middle of the lake. Everyone but Harris dove in head first, ignoring the abandoned no diving sign. The lake was colder than expected, and I wasn't the only one to shiver a little. That didn't stop us, though. Within seconds, I saw a bikini top being tossed around like a ball, and there were smiles every which way I turned. Well, except for Harris. He turned to us saying something, I'm not sure what. He was pointing, trying to get our attention, but that wasn't happening anytime soon. I had Carrie right next to my ear, asking me to keep her warm. Camden and Tammy were just full-on making out against the floating dock. I casually looked the way Harris pointed. I could see something in the distance. There was someone on the beach. I didn't know what to make of it. Even at a distance, I could tell they were tall, somewhere around 6'8", possibly a man. He was wearing some kind of World War II-era rubber gas mask, but without a filter. He had this massive grey trench coat that looked too big even on him. It left a long trail in the sand. There were countless pockets sewn on the outside. He had a crossbow. Not one of those black, sleek, modern ones, but something he'd put together in a garage somewhere. The thing was massive, probably made from the leaf spring of an old car. It was solid metal. The second we looked his way, he hooked the crossbow to something on his belt and stepped it into the sand. Despite such a massive frame, I could tell he was struggling. There was a loud click. He pulled something out of his coat. An arm's length of sharpened rebar. It just took a couple of seconds all in all, and the sight was too strange to react to appropriately. Harris looked back at the rest of us as the conversation died down. We were still smiling, but it wasn't a conscious reaction. It felt like rabbits freezing at the sight of a predator, hoping it wouldn't see us. But of course it did. We were completely exposed on the open water. Harris turned to his sister, casually pointing towards the beach. You know that guy? Tammy clung to Camden's shoulder, looking towards the beach. I saw her eyes go wide as the man on the beach raised the crossbow. He didn't need time to aim. We were sitting ducks. There was a click, a thunk, and a whip-like snap. It was less than a second. A bolt of sharpened rebar, as long as my arm, burrowed deep into Harris's chest. There was no scream or cry, just a puff of air as his lungs emptied. I still hear that sound sometimes. A single forceful cough, like he swallowed something the wrong way. The force was so intense that it looked like turning off a switch. Harris smacked down into the floating dock with complete abandon, splaying his arms out like a crucifixion. Immediate panic erupted. Camden held Tammy back from climbing up on the floating dock. Carrie and Pam hid under it. I didn't understand what was happening and lingered a little too long, watching our attacker hook the crossbow on his belt and step down, preparing for a second shot. Hadn't it been for Camden calling my name, I wouldn't have snapped out of it. I dove, swam over to the others, and hid under the floating dock. There was already blood dripping between the planks. Tammy couldn't stop screaming, her eyes so wide they looked black. The shouting was so loud and constant that it just blended into a mix, making it sound like nothing at all. This was just what the world was like now. Panicked open mouths, screaming at everyone for answers. There was an awful crackling sound as 4 planks were torn apart by a second shot. The force rippled through the air, and I could feel it even at a distance. We all hid under the dock, keeping our heads down and trying to show as little of ourselves as possible. But seconds later, I heard him firing again. Another couple planks exploded into tattered fibers, the whole funneling Harris's blood right down on us, mixing the smell of wet wood with sickening volumes of blood. Everyone was talking and screaming over one another. Carrie was screaming at us to dive, while Pam was telling us to split up. We didn't do either. Instead, I watched through the gaps in the dock how the man reloaded again and got down on his knees. He was planning something. He was shooting at an angle, trying to get the bolt to skip across the surface. It worked. There was this approaching thoo noise heading straight for us. I could see the ripples on the lake where the bolt had touched down. It was dark under the dock, but I could hear the shot slamming into the back of Pam's cranium. The water got warm as life left her. Tammy tried to get away, but Camden was holding her back. If she swam out from under the dock, she'd be an easy target. Instead, we hid behind the supports, these large white air tanks made of hardened plastic with little blue sunflower logos on the side. Another shot rippled across the water. Thoo. It smashed through the dock, effectively ripping it in half as the last planks shattered. Some of the supports came loose, but me and Carrie clung to them like life vests. "They're not hard enough," Camden screamed, holding Tammy close. "We gotta do something." "What?" Carrie screamed back. "What the fuck are we supposed to do?" Thoo. Another shot. This one crashed into the side of the support I was holding onto, ripping it out of my arms. It snapped my shoulder so bad that I got a bruise. It was such massive force, like a battering ram. I was fine, but left exposed. I got a clear view of him hooking the crossbow to his belt again and stepping down on the crossbow, already preparing another bolt from his jacket. I waved at Camden, showing I was okay, then I dove. The support I'd been hiding behind was intact, but had drifted off about 10 feet. I could make it. Diving down, the water was surprisingly clear. I could almost see all the way to the bottom. There was more debris than I anticipated, things blown out from the beach and claimed by the lake. A ruined rowboat, an old tarp, the remains of a parasol. The screaming was just a faint murmur. I saw their feet kicking wildly. Looking over at Carrie, her feet had stopped kicking, and the water was turning red. The screams got louder, but not from her. I came up behind the white air tank I'd been clinging to. Tammy wasn't even making sense at this point. It was just an animalistic screeching. Camden looked like a fish out of water, his mouth wide open. The floating dock was broken in two, but the pieces were still held up by the remaining supports. It was a little easier to hide behind, but it was just a matter of time before this whole thing would sink. I dove down again. At first it was to get away from a potential shot, but I had an idea. I swam down and grabbed the tarp and the old parasol. It was just a couple of aluminum poles at this point. Coming back up, I held the tarp over myself like a makeshift tent, using one of the poles at an angle. I figured it might obscure me just enough for him to miss a shot or two. It smelled like old dirt and algae, but I was too panicked to care. "He's gonna run out of bolts," Camden yelled. "We gotta bait them out." There was something to it. The bolts were large, and even with a large jacket, there couldn't be that many left. Tammy watched him closely, and as soon as he finished reloading, she called out, "Now!" Then we all dove, trying to move around. I ducked my head under the surface as I heard that approaching thoo. Another bolt gone, disappeared into the lake. I came back up, hiding under that tarp. I tried to take long breaths, but it was difficult. Not knowing when the next bolt would fire meant it could come just as I exhaled. As Tammy called out another "now," I dove down like a bullet. I looked back at the others. No more blood in the water. All feet were still kicking. We managed to bait another couple bolts. Then it was a long pause. No one was calling out anything. I looked out from under the tarp. Camden and Tammy were looking out from the side of the wrecked dock. The man in the gas mask was just standing there at the shore, looking at us. He seemed to have one more bolt at the ready, but was reluctant to fire. Maybe he wanted to align that perfect shot. "He's waiting for us to get out," Camden said. "He can't keep guessing. He needs a clear shot." Tammy just stared at him. She couldn't look away. Camden was talking to her, but his words just passed right through. "He can't stay here forever," Camden continued. "We wait, and then we split up." Tammy nodded, keeping her eyes on him still. We must have stayed in the water for well over an hour, clinging to the remains of the dock. The sun was setting, quickly making the water inhospitable. We were shivering and our lips turned blue. There was a very real chance we'd get hypothermia. My hands were cramped into claws from holding onto the air tank too hard. I could barely feel my feet. He wasn't leaving. He was standing in that exact same spot, waiting to load his crossbow. The bolt dangled from his hand. Camden's jaw was chattering. He was worse off than me and Tammy. I was getting worried he might lose consciousness if we didn't act soon. It was getting darker, so it would be harder to his us. It was now or never. We had to try. We decided to go on the count of 3. Tammy counted us down. 3, 2, 1. We all got out of cover. Tammy called out, "Now," and I dove. The final bolt sailed right past us. Thu. We were in the clear. I popped my head up to see the others heading straight for the shore. The man was just standing there trying to figure out his next move. We were halfway to the shore when I saw him put his hand down his other jacket pocket. He pulled out another bolt. It was a trick. He'd faked running out. Camden called on us to scatter. Tammy told us to keep going for the shore. I begged them to get to cover. Our voices intermingled into a yelling mess as I saw him step down on the crossbow and load another bolt. He took aim at us. "Now," Tammy called out. "Fucking now!" We all dove, but we were out of breath. A couple of seconds passed, and as I broke through the surface, I heard that familiar thumping. Thu. Except now it connected to something with a sickening crunch. I hid behind one of the air tanks, and I could see someone else do the same in the distance. I couldn't see who it was. The lake got eerily quiet, leaving only the echo of bird song. I was colder than I thought. I hadn't noticed my teeth chattering. I clung to the side of that air tank, letting my legs rest. I had to break the silence. "Camden," I called out. "Yeah," he responded. His voice was weak, his throat raw. It barely sounded like him anymore. I could almost hear his breathing, even from a distance. "Tammy," he called out. "Tammy, are you—" There was no response, only birdsong. Another click as a bolt was loaded. I could barely see the man on the shore, but the silhouette was clear. The crossbow was raised and ready. He was listening, aiming. He might have had more bolts than we'd anticipated, but he was making them count. I slowly paddled back towards the tarp I'd dragged up, wrapping it over the air tank. In the dark, and from a distance, it sort of looked like a person. "I'm heading to shore," Camden called out. "See you there." "Hold on," I called back. "Wait a minute." "I can't, man," he sighed. "I can't. I gotta." "Hold on," I repeated. "Don't fuck this up." There was no response. I just heard the pitter-patter of someone paddling back to shore. I got out of cover, beelining towards Camden. Another thunk as a bolt released. Thu. It smacked into the air tank I'd covered with the tarp, punching a hole straight through. Camden called out my name, but I didn't respond. I figured if the attacker thought he'd gotten me, maybe he would stop firing. Then again, maybe he'd go for Camden instead. I had to keep a low profile. Something brushed against my leg. I was in the middle of the debris from the floating dock. There was a piece of garden hose that Harris had used for repairs. I carefully brought it up, blowing out the water inside. I could use it as a makeshift snorkel. I swam towards the shore at an angle as slowly as I could. As I got closer, I dove down. Fumbling with my stiff hands, I found a large rock. I held it close as an anchor to weigh me down. I held the hose up over the surface. I could breathe through it, but it was bitter taste, leaving a layer of bacteria on my tongue. The waves would sometimes go a little higher than anticipated, forcing a gulp of water going down my gullet. It was probably the longest couple of minutes of my life. I was shivering with every step, clinging to a slippery stone at the bottom of the lake. Shallow breaths interrupted by little drops tickling my throat, but I had to keep going. The water was getting too cold. Soon enough, my head was just below the surface. I had to be really close to the shore. I got down on my knees, crawling the last few feet. As my head breached the surface, I saw that I was off to the side, away from the beach. There were rocks covering the ground, cutting the soles of my feet as I struggled to stay quiet. The evening air was chilling. I made my way through the underbrush, stepping on roots and fallen branches along the way. I couldn't feel my fingers, and my teeth wouldn't stop chattering. I stepped over a fallen chain-linked fence, noticing a half-rusted old metal sign. A few letters had faded, but the message was clear. Private property, violators will be shot. There was even a little smiley in the corner. I saw the beach from the tree line. Camden had made it ashore, but he was barely holding on. He was laying in the sand, doing his best just to breathe. The man with the gas mask was approaching him with a loaded crossbow. But he wasn't shooting. Not yet. If he wanted Camden dead, he'd be dead already. Instead, He just approached. He poked at Camden with the tip of his boot, but nothing happened. No reaction. I think Camden had lost consciousness by then. Maybe losing everyone was too much for him to bear. No matter the cause, Camden had completely given up. The crossbow man seemingly decided against wasting a bolt on him. Instead, he calmly raised the no diving sign that Tammy had posed with earlier, unloaded his crossbow, and wandered off like nothing had happened. As soon as the coast was clear, I ran like a man possessed. By the time I made it to Camden, he was barely breathing. I looked around the beach, couldn't see my things in the dark. I tapped Camden on the cheek, trying to get him to focus, but his eyes were rolled back. There was a noise. It came from Camden's clothes, just a little further down by the water. His phone. It was his worried parents, calling for the third time today. It was easy to forget how often Camden talked to them. I must have sounded absolutely unhinged when I answered, begging them to call for help. Not long after that, I had the emergency services on the line. I had to perform CPR to keep Camden breathing. By the time the EMTs got there, he'd lost a lot of color. We were both severely hypothermic. Those few final minutes at Lake Atabat was nothing short of psychedelic. Colored lights from 4 different vehicles mixing in the dark, highlighting angry and stressed faces. The occasional flash of a camera photographing a body washed up on the beach. A paramedic trying to get me to focus on a little light that he held in front of my eyes. I heard him talk, but it was too distant, like he wasn't really there. For a moment I thought I might have hallucinated this whole thing. Maybe I was still out on the lake. Maybe this was me watching my life pass before my eyes. I could hear that thumping noise as the metal bolts skipped across the surface in my mind. I could hear it so loudly and clearly that it might as well have been real, a problem that persists to this day. And as we left Lake Atabat, I could imagine the glare of 2 slides of glass from a gas mask in the distance, watching, waiting. The police came to talk to me at the hospital. They were asking about us trespassing and what had happened. They didn't seem to believe me when I told them about the crossbow man. Autopsies revealed that Pam, Carrie, Harris and Tammy all had alcohol in their bodies, which was enough to blame it all on some kind of accident. The police had a smashed floating dock, plenty of alcohol and 4 dead bodies. They connected their own lines, puncture wounds and witness statements be damned. There were no charges, no investigation, no outcry. Harris and Tammy's parents lost 2 children that day. Camden and I have since tried talking to them, but there has just been no reasoning with them. I don't blame them. They're completely broken. Camden and I have been back there a couple of times, putting up signs of our own, warning passers-by of a murderer. I was back there last year, and someone had taken the sign down. The no diving sign was as visible as ever, though. That last summer at Lake Atabat was the worst thing I've ever experienced. Just seeing a body of water can make my teeth chatter nowadays. It's like my blood remembers before my mind does. I'm thankful that I can still talk to Camden about it. I think he's taken it worse than me. He's much quieter nowadays, and he rarely goes outside. We're the only ones who really know, and the only ones who truly believe. We're tried to tell others, but they think we're making this up. It sounds much better to have a crossbow-wielding lunatic than people drowning from alcohol poisoning and a failing floating dock, and people believe what they want. There are accidents all the time. People go missing all the time. But sometimes the answer is right there, and no one is asking the questions. The Northwoods winters have always been quiet. The wide stretches of pines and hemlocks, combined with a couple feet of snow, meant that almost no sound traveled through the air. Still, even in the dead of winter, some sounds could always be made out. The wind whistling through the trees, the scuffling of creatures who had not gone to sleep for the winter, the occasional howl from a distant wolf, all sounds that could be picked out amongst the silence. Somehow there was always some sort of noise, yet the forests of my land made none. The silence is somehow more deafening than any bustling city or crowded suburb. I find myself straining my ears, desperate for noise, but there is none, only silence. Nothing dares to make a peep while the fawns are stalking. I live alone in a cabin in the Northwoods of Wisconsin, just a small wooden cabin with 10 acres of wilderness surrounding it. untouched for generations. This land has been in my family since my great-great-grandparents immigrated here from Germany. It has never been logged or altered in any way, as my family preferred to use it for game hunting. The pelts and furs of the various wildlife species that roamed our property kept my family alive for 2 centuries. To this day, it is still used for that same purpose. Ducks, rabbits, pheasants, and quail all end up on my table every year. However, the deer on my property are the best of the bunch. My land produces some of the biggest bucks and does this side of the Mississippi. I sell the meat to local restaurants and the pelts and antlers online. I also keep chickens and have a small vegetable garden whose products I sell at the farmer's market during the warmer months. I have made a good life for myself up here, but that life is no more. It started off small a couple years back. I noticed a lot of the deer I spotted on my property starting to look a little sickly. They were skinny and often seemed disoriented. Sometimes they would just wander in circles in forest clearings, wheezing in distress. Even weirder, I began finding a lot of the deer in the lake. I couldn't understand it at first. What could possibly be dragging them into the lake and drowning them? No big aquatic predators existed like that this far north. No way in hell. It wasn't until I personally witnessed a buck walk straight into the lake and drown itself that the mystery was finally solved. The final straw came when the hunting season came around. I was sitting up in my stand one morning and watched as a doe stumbled out into the clearing. I raised my bow and took aim, but stopped before I fired. God, she looked just awful. She was practically a walking skeleton. There wasn't a single ounce of fat on her whole body. She was foaming at the mouth and barely able to stand, her knees wobbling beneath her. Looking at her then, I bet a slight breeze could have knocked her to her side. I was so distracted by her grotesque form that it took me a while to realize that she was looking right at me. She stared straight at the tip of the arrow I was pointing at her heart and did nothing. It's almost as if she couldn't register that she was in danger. Or she just didn't care. We stayed like that for a while, just staring at each other. Eventually I lowered my bow. I couldn't bring myself to shoot her. She was just too pitiful. Looking into her eyes, I could have sworn I saw disappointment cross her gaze. There were a couple more moments of silence between us before she suddenly dropped to the ground. She was dead. It was at this point I knew I needed to call someone to help me figure this out. I normally hate having other people on my property, let alone the government, but I had no choice. I called the DNR and they sent someone to take some samples of the doe. If you are familiar with deer, then you may have recognized the signs of the now well-known chronic wasting disease, or CWD. Chronic wasting disease is a contagious, always fatal brain disease affecting animals in the cervid family. CWD is a prion disease, meaning that bacteria and viruses play no role in the infection. Prions are proteins, and healthy prions are found lining the cells of healthy animals and humans. However, a disease like CWD causes those prions to warp. It starts off with just one prion, but it slowly spreads throughout the entirety of the cervid's body over time. Sometimes, it can take over 2 years for the disease to finally kill off the deer. In the meantime, they will be afflicted with symptoms such as emaciation, excessive salivation, lack of muscle coordination, difficulty in swallowing, excessive thirst, and excessive urination. The excessive thirst drives them to water, but they often struggle to drink. They will dunk their entire head into rivers or ponds because it is the only way they can get any water into their mouths. This often results in them accidentally drowning themselves, hence why I found so many drowned deer in my lake. These prions can be spread by 1v1 contact or be transmitted into the environment, such as soil, food, and water, through feces, urine, and other bodily fluids of an unhealthy deer. CWD can spread to deer if they ingest these unhealthy CWD prions from their environment. These prions can live in the environment for years at a time. This makes managing the disease incredibly difficult, if not near impossible. Once it has spread, there is no going back. I was given the go-ahead by the DNR to kill any infected deer on my property on site, whether it was during hunting season or not. I tried my best to rid my land of the infection, but it was no use. Things only seemed to get worse. A couple years passed, and it looked like my land was almost barren of deer. The last season I had was pitiful. The only thing I shot was one scrawny, diseased doe whose meat or pelt would be no use to anyone. I was distraught, but there was nothing I could do. The infection had won. I had just about given up ever having healthy deer on my property. That was until spring came. The snow had just started melting outside. The birds were beginning to arrive in droves from their vacation south and lit up the forest with their song. I was happy that the long winter had finally ended, but I couldn't help but feel down. Usually my land was alive with the arrival of new fawns at this time. Big healthy does would wander my property, trailing one or two beautiful baby fawns with them. The promise of the next generation soothed something in my heart. If I saw fawns, it meant my land was fertile and my livelihood would continue. That contentment had not entered my heart in some years. As I gazed depressingly out my window, something caught my eye. A doe. She was scrawny and exhausted looking, much like all the other deer I had seen these past years, but behind her trailed a surprise. A big, beautiful baby fawn followed her. It seemed perfectly healthy. It was plump, clean, and happy as could be. It trotted happily after its mum, not seeming in the slightest bit bothered by her deteriorating state. I couldn't believe it. How is this possible? I had not had healthy fawns in years. On the rare chance a fawn was born, it would always die before summer's end, either taken by disease or starved because their mother died before they could be weaned. At the time, I figured that the fawn would only remain healthy for a little while. Eventually, the ruin of my land would take its life too. Except it didn't. Not only that, but it wasn't the only healthy fawn to be found. By the time the summer ended, I had at least a dozen happy, healthy fawns, all of which were led by a scrawny, diseased doe who looks at those she was seconds away from her painful end. I couldn't understand it. How were they so healthy? It should be impossible. Their mothers certainly couldn't be producing enough milk to sustain them. Even if they could, the milk would be diseased. The fawns should be infected by this point and starting their decline. Yet they weren't. At the time, this made me happy. I disregarded any nagging concern with half-hearted excuses. Maybe the mothers weren't as sick as I thought, or maybe the fawns were immune to the disease somehow. If I had been paying closer attention, maybe I would have seen the signs sooner. The first time I sensed something may have been off with the fawns was around the time hunting season came around. Last year my hunt was pitiful, as previously mentioned. This year, though, I had the slightest glimmer of hope that I may be able to kill something worthwhile. I never even made it to my stand, though, as I was stopped in my tracks by a grisly discovery. Well, stopped in my tracks might not be the best choice of words. I literally tripped over the damn thing. While trekking to my stand in the dark of the morning, I tripped over a large, warm body. As I fell forward, my hands landed on something warm, fuzzy, and wet. I yelped in surprise as I fell, getting up as quickly as possible once the fuzzy texture hit my hands. As I was trying to regain my footing, the most horrid stench hit my nose. It was so bad it almost caused me to stumble back to the ground again. I managed to keep my composure and took a couple steps back to get a look at the creature. Below me was one of the most grotesque sights I had ever seen. It was a doe, not just a doe, but one of the does I saw with a fawn earlier in the year. I recognized her by a distinct notch in her ear that none of the other deer on my property had. She was dead, as to be expected. However, the manner in which it died was of major question. The poor thing was eviscerated. It was gutted from tip to tail, its organs spilled out and rotting all over the ground. Small chunks of its flesh were missing all over its body. Looking closer, it was obvious that the flesh was ripped away with sharp teeth. Obviously, something had been eating it. The doe's eyes were missing as well, cleanly scooped out, leaving only hollow black holes. Usually this wouldn't be of much concern, as there are wolves and coyotes in these parts, both of which could easily take down a small, sickly deer. Plus, the missing eyes could have been pecked out by crows or other scavenging birds, who often like to go for the soft parts first. But something wasn't right. The cut that gutted the doe was too clean. No wolf or coyote could do that. Plus, when I examined the eyes more closely, I could not find any trace of the eyeball at all. Normally, if birds peck out the eyes, at least some eye goop is left behind. Also, why was so much of the deer left behind? A predator would not leave all these organs uneaten to rot. As I looked closer, I could see that the liver remained there. It was rotted, completely useless now, but present. That was very confusing. The liver is the prized organ of any kill, always one of the first things to be eaten. No competent predator would leave it untouched. Also, where were all the scavengers? It was getting quite late in the year. Normally, every opportunistic predator or omnivore in the area would be swarming this kill. Yet it remained mostly untouched, except for the missing chunks of flesh and the hollowed-out eyes. It was almost as if whatever killed this deer didn't understand what it should be doing with it. It knew it wanted to kill, it knew it wanted to eat, but it didn't know how to do it most efficiently or what parts were most nutritious. The more I looked at the doe, the more uneasy I felt. I had seen hundreds of dead animals before, but something about this one felt off. It felt like I was breaking some sort of unspoken rule coming near this kill. It felt like something I wasn't supposed to see. I didn't go to my stand that morning. Instead, I returned home, too unnerved to continue my hunt. I made sure to take some pictures of the deer to have on record. The only other explanation I had for such a strange kill was a possible poacher. If someone was killing on my land without my knowledge, it is important that I keep a record of it. Yet, something inside me couldn't buy that explanation, as much as I wanted to. Something just wasn't right. I spent the rest of that week worrying about the doe and what killed her. What worried me even more so, though, was the fact that her fawn was nowhere to be seen. Eventually, I worked up the courage to return to the site of the kill to search the area, looking for the fawn, but I never found it. Even more strange, the doe seemed to still be relatively untouched, if not a tad more decomposed. No scavengers dared to go near her, for reasons that were unclear to me then. The situation continued to worsen as winter settled over the land. I found more dead does, all of them killed in a very similar manner to the first. All of their fawns were missing as well, nowhere to be found. Over time, the smell of rotting corpses began to be carried on the wind, desecrating the sanctity of my land further. I kept waiting for scavengers to come and clean the corpses out, but none ever did. For whatever reason, no creature on earth seemed to want to touch those does. The final straw was when I woke up one morning to find a dead doe right outside my window one morning. I could handle them when they were out of sight, but I couldn't watch a deer corpse start to rot right outside my door. If the scavengers were not going to deal with this problem, then I would. I spent the whole day traveling around my property, picking up doe corpses and loading them into the back of my ATV. There was a large sinkhole located at the edge of my property. I dumped each corpse into the hole and filled it over with leftover dirt from my garden projects. Throughout the whole process, I felt a distinct feeling of wrongness. A horrible feeling hovered over me, as though every muscle and neuron in my body was screaming at me to stop. It felt as though I were doing something horribly wrong that would be paid for later in full. I couldn't understand the feeling then, but I understand it now. Finally, I returned home and collapsed onto my couch, exhausted. My body ached horribly, and my nerves were racked beyond repair. I began to sob, all of the fear and the sorrow of the last couple years overtaking me in an instant. I cried like that for a long while, unable to pull myself together. A million questions flooded my mind. What was killing my does? What happened to their fawns? Why was my land so devastated by this disease? What did I do to deserve this? Eventually, the tears seemed to slow, and the thoughts began to quiet. I was left with a feeling of numb emptiness. In that deadened state, I took idle notice that it had begun to snow outside. I checked the weather and was notified that a big blizzard was on the way. I guess I was in for a long night. I decided that a hot shower was in order, as I was still stained with deer blood from the day's events. Plus, maybe the hot water could wash off the remaining anxiety from the day. I tossed my clothes, as they were beyond saving, and jumped into the shower. I felt myself begin to relax as the hot water ran over my body and soaked into my skin. I took my sweet time in the shower, making sure to wash every inch of the diseased blood off me. It was only after I got out of the shower and was beginning to dry my hair that I became aware of a soft noise coming from outside. It sounded like an animal cry. I threw on my robe and started to walk towards my front door. As I got closer to the door, the sound became clearer. It was bleating, Not only that, but it was the bleating of a... No, that's not possible. I quickly rushed to the door and threw it open to reveal... a fawn. Holy shit, a fawn. I was overtaken with joy. One of the fawns survived. I couldn't believe it. These little guys were resilient. It stood silently in the snow, not moving at all. It stared at me with its round, curious eyes, examining me for a moment. As it stared at me, I stared right back. However, the more I looked at it, the more uneasy I felt. It just didn't look right. It was much larger than it was in the spring, but still not the size of a full-grown deer. It retained its spots, marking its young age, but they were beginning to fade. Its legs and neck seemed to be disproportionately long compared to what they should be. It was very scrawny, its bones jutting out underneath its fur. Looking harder, faint patches of missing fur could be made out amongst the pelt. Dark strains matted the pelt as well, although the dark of night and thick snowfall made it difficult to determine what the stains were. As I continued to examine the fawn, more small bodies emerged from the shadows. I was taken aback. By the time they had all come into the light, there were about 12 in total. All of them looked similar to the first, gangly with missing patches of fur and dark stains covering various parts of their body. At first I felt sad. I assumed the disease must have gotten to them too, and I was wrong about them being immune. But then, the first of the fawns began to screech. The sound was deafening. I screamed out in agony as I covered my ears. The other fawns began to join in, and the noise became unbearable. I felt a wetness begin to cover my hands, and I quickly retreated inside, unable to stand the sound any longer. I locked the door and looked down at my hands to see they were covered in blood. I ran to the mirror and checked my ears. As I suspected, they were bleeding heavily. Those fucking things burst my eardrums. My head ached horribly and I couldn't hear anything except ringing. I quickly scrambled to my closet and pulled out my rifle I used occasionally during deer season. I preferred to hunt with a bow, but nothing short of a firearm seemed appropriate at this moment. Through the ringing in my ears, I heard a soft bleating outside the large A-frame window that covered the south side of my house. My heart dropped into my stomach. They weren't done with me yet. I crept to the window to see all the fawns had migrated to the light. They also looked up at me, standing perfectly in unison with a sort of triangle-like formation. The lead fawn, the one I saw first outside my door, stood closest to the window, at the tip of the triangle. It stepped forward further into the light. I let out a small gasp, stepping back in shock, as I finally got to see the thing clearly for the first time. Its legs and neck were unproportionally long, as previously mentioned, except now I could see that the disproportions were even worse. The missing patches of fur I couldn't quite make out earlier were now clear as day. It was obvious that parts of the fawn were rotting, as chunks of its flesh were missing throughout its pelt, leaving maggot-infested wounds in its place. Its hooves were all wrong, malformed to create 3 razor-sharp cutting tools that resembled wolf claws. Its bony appearance was worse in the light, as it became obvious that bones of its knees were actually protruding out from under its skin, creating sharp daggers. Blood trails stained the fur from which the bones broke the skin. If it hurt, the fawn showed no indication. It was then that I noticed the thing was baring its fangs. Yes, fucking fangs. Its mouth was full of canine-like teeth, stained with the blood of whatever it had previously killed. Looking at its mouth, the images of the missing chunks of flesh from the does flashed through my mind. I began to feel sick to my stomach. I guess I know what was killing the does now. Its eyes had also rolled into the back of its head, the whites showing prominently in contrast to the blood that seeped from its eye sockets. Whatever the unholy creature that sat before me was, it was not a fawn. No, it was something else. Something warped either by the infection of its mother or the unholy workings of another world. It took all my strength to not shoot through my window. I wanted to blow the things off just so I didn't have to look at it anymore, but I couldn't risk allowing those things an opening into my house. There were 12 of them after all, and only one of me. I don't think I could kill them fast enough. I spent the entire night huddled in a corner of my house, silently sobbing while clutching my rifle. Through the pounding headache and the ringing, I could hear the sounds of screeching outside my walls. They were communicating, trying to find a way in. If I hadn't locked up to prepare for the storm earlier in the night, I would probably be dead now. But luckily for me, the fawns failed in their mission. The morning came, bringing an end to the storm and the return of cell service. I called an ambulance, claiming I accidentally fired my gun while cleaning it and burst my eardrums. I don't know why I lied. Maybe it was because I didn't think they would believe me, or maybe I was in shock. Or maybe I was just being selfish in that I was terrified telling others meant they would destroy the land I have come to love so much, even if it was nothing but an unholy graveyard now. Right before they loaded me into the ambulance, though, I was greeted with the sight of a severed, eyeless doe head sitting on my front porch. Looking closely, it was obvious the doe had a notch in her ear. Looks like Daisy has come back to haunt me again. The message was clear. You tainted our kill. You are no longer welcome here. Leave. So that's what I did. The second I got out of the hospital, I took an Uber to the nearest airport and flew to South Carolina. I am staying with my sister now. I didn't tell her what happened, just that I missed my family and needed a fresh start. I'm trying to start my new life here now. The property up north remains untouched and unsold. I can only pray that whatever curse or disease brought those demons to my land stays within the confines of its borders. Maybe, just maybe, if they are left to their own devices, if their kills aren't desecrated by human hands, this will also just turn out to be a bad dream. If not, I suggest to all readers to maybe stay away from the Northwoods for a little while. I don't know how much longer they will be safe. This is my personal account of an incident that occurred in Alaska back in 2019. I haven't spoken of this incident to anyone but my therapist and my best friend. Despite many sessions, and even attempts of exposure therapy, which I will explain later, this event still haunts me. Maybe if I post this here, I can gain some semblance of peace. So, like I said, it was 2019, I was 25 at the time. I'd been saving up money to do on some backcountry camping up in Alaska. I live on the East Coast, and while my job was paying all right, I was taking up some under-the-table jobs, house painting, house sitting, pet sitting, and what have you, to help me out financially for the trip. I also had a friend set me up with their uncle who is a bush pilot to handle getting me to and from my camping location. This was my first and biggest mistake. Now I had very little experience with camping outside of occasional weekend camping at state parks, and I did some camping excursions, nothing super challenging, when I was in Boy Scouts. But my friend's uncle, Mark, knew some good spots that were remote to an extent, but easy to get to in the event of an emergency, by bush plane standards, that is. So yeah, no trekking to the nearest highway or road, unless I wanted to walk for a day or so through rugged terrain. My parents helped me out with getting me some emergency supplies, food, hydration packs, first aid kit, bear spray, etc. But Mark loaned me a spare rifle of his in case I would need it. Even though I was a non-resident, I could still carry a firearm under state law. I've hunted before when I was a teen, so I had experience in that regard. Plus, I didn't have to worry about the hassle of transporting a firearm and dealing with airport regulations. Mark also hooked me up with a satellite phone as well, so my cell phone was going to be nothing more than a camera. I didn't have the money for a good camera for photography or anything, so I had to make do. The plan was to be dropped off at where I was camping, camp out for 5 days, and be picked up on day 6. I didn't want to use up all 2 weeks of my allotted PTO at work, so I kept the trip condensed. Because this was my first time out, Mark helped me pick out a site based on his recommendations. The spot he chose wasn't one he went to often, as he typically flew in hunters and anglers, who typically were going to areas with more rugged terrain. It was relatively flat, not a lot of dense forests, maybe some patches here and there further in, and my campsite was going to be set up near a small lake with a good view of some mountains in the distance. Now, I'm sure a lot of people would like to know where I was specifically, but Mark no longer takes people to that location, regardless of their experience or not, and he no longer does fly-ins for anyone who isn't a hunter. It hurt his business a bit, because fishing is so popular in Alaska, but he ended up retiring altogether due to COVID the following year. As for why I won't mention the location, as far as I am aware, the location didn't have a name on an official map, and if Mark had ever flown near that area, it was just a tiny blip during a scenic sightseeing trip. The other reason was because of what I experienced on that trip. What I saw, I wish I could get it out of my head, out of my dreams. After Mark dropped me off and helped me unload my gear, I spent most of my first day setting up camp, not far from the lake, a good 85 yards or so, or a little over 77 meters. I found a nice and remarkably dry, dead log that had some good-sized branches, so that was my main supply of firewood. A short walk away there was a small grove of trees inland from the lake that I set up as my food storage location. Mark said bears were not uncommon in this area, though not necessarily the best place to see some, but it was still advised to keep food hanging from a tree, out of reach from any potential bears. The lake had a rather unique shape to it, which made it easy for me to set up a good spot for a cooking area. For those unfamiliar, the campsite, food storage and kitchen area should form a triangle, which some people refer to as a Bermuda Triangle. Day 2 and 3 were not entirely uneventful for the most part. Day 2, I was eating lunch at my campsite while watching a bull moose dive into the lake to eat the plants at the bottom. Day 3, I did some hiking, found a small hill with only a couple trees on top, and I decided to sit down and observe a herd of elk grazing for a good while. Exploring around the lake, I found a small rusted boat buried under some branches. It was in rough shape, but could still float on the water, so I dragged it back with me to camp and put it near the lakeshore. Figured I could go out on the lake and take some good photos from it. Day 4 is when things started to get weird. It got unnaturally quiet that morning. The birds were not singing, and the only sounds were from the lake and the bugs. Despite making sure I packed mosquito repellent, the bugs were a big nuisance if I was near the lake. I hesitated to travel away from my tent, outside of walking to the lake. I tried not to let the silence bother me, and I occupied my time with reading inside my tent. As the sun dipped down and darkness began to creep in, I was starting to feel uneasy. Like a primal kind of fear, I decided I was going to make my campfire a bit bigger than I normally make it, enough that the light shone further away. As I turned in for the night, I made sure my bear spray and the rifle were within reach inside my tent, but I had trouble sleeping. The silence was unnerving. I was fighting myself not to toss and turn, because I was too afraid of the noise attracting something I did not want to encounter alone at night. Just as I was about to close my eyes, I heard a branch snap. That woke me up faster than a bucket of ice water, and I immediately froze. I could heard something coming into my campsite. I reached for the bear spray and held it tightly to my chest. As slowly as humanly possible, I turned over and saw the shadow of an animal on the wall of my tent, illuminated by the glow of the moonlight. The animal was big, about the size of a trophy brown bear, but the silhouette looked off. I just figured it was from some sort of distortion from the angle I was looking at, but the noises it made were not like that of a bear. It made huffing noises like a bear, but the sound wasn't exactly the same. I could tell it was starting to approach my tent, so I had my thumb ready on the safety catch of the spray. Suddenly the creature tore through the tent like tissue paper and grabbed my sleeping bag in its jaws. The strength of the animal caused me to nearly hit my head off the ground, and for a brief moment I caught a look at the animal's face. The animal's head looked similar to a bear's, but there was something uncanny about it, uncanny in a way that I cannot entirely articulate. It wasn't malformed or anything, it just looked off. As the animal dragged me out of the tent, I popped off the safety catch and sprayed it in the face. The animal reeled back, groaning in pain. It was a horrendous noise, not like anything I've ever heard. I heard it run off into the thick brush, and as I went to head for the remains of my tent, I could hear this crashing and cracking noise from the animal. I was too scared that it was going to come back, so I ran for the boat. As I was pushing the boat into the water, I turned back, and from the fading glow of the campfire, I saw the animal begin to charge. I wasted no time in getting the boat into the water, and I began to paddle as quickly as I could. I knew the creature would be faster, but I was praying that I got far enough away from shore it wouldn't attempt to chase me. The creature didn't stop at the lakeshore, and it made its way through the water, at least up to its chest, and stopped. I could faintly see it from the moonlight, and then it ran for my tent. While I couldn't see it all that well, I could tell from the horrendous noise that the animal was thrashing around my camping supplies. I hoped to God that the rifle and satellite phone were intact. I curled up in the boat and tried my best to sleep, but I was drenched up to my waist, and I was shivering like crazy. After a good 15 minutes, the noises from my campsite died down, and everything became still again. I never slept through the night, but occasionally would paddle the boat to make sure it didn't float off towards shore during the night. When morning approached, I was still too afraid to go back to my campsite. I waited until around noon, when my stomach began to protest. I picked up the paddle and slowly and as quietly as possible paddled back to my campsite. As I reached the shore, I still waited for several minutes, just to make sure I didn't hear the creature approach. I slowly walked back to what remained of my campsite. The tent was nothing more than snapped poles and tattered fabric, and what was left of my sleeping bag was unrecognizable as belonging to a sleeping bag. Unfortunately, Mark's rifle had a busted stock, and the wooden forearm had a big crack down it. My backpack had been torn apart, and clothes and gear were scattered all around. I found my binoculars laying in the fire pit. Luckily, it looked like the fire had gone out before they landed in it, as there were no scorch marks on them. One of the lenses was cracked, but was still usable. I scoped out the food cache area, only to find my food cache missing, and some busted branches around the trees. I quickly grabbed a small backpack that was missing a strap, and quickly stuffed some clothes into it and the binoculars. I searched around the campsite for anything else of use. The satellite phone was still in its pouch in what was left of the larger backpack, so I grabbed that, and a couple emergency flares. I would pause every few moments, just to make sure the creature from last night didn't show up. My bear spray can lay over by the dead log, and as I went over to grab it, that's when I heard a low growl coming from the thicket. I froze. If I had been wearing a t-shirt at the time, I would have seen the goosebumps that covered my arms. I slowly began backing away from my campsite back to the rusted boat, and that's when it emerged from the brush. It had the appearance of a bear, but like how you would probably envision a bear in your dreams, it had an uncanniness to its appearance that I am unable to describe. My mind was trying to make sense of what I was seeing, and part of me was, and still is, wondering if the sleepless night was messing with my vision. My legs were beginning to shake, and tears were streaming down my face as it watched me. I was terrified of what it might do next. The animal lumbered towards me, and I tossed a lit flare at it, in the hopes it would scare the creature off. It backed off momentarily. I took the opportunity to run for the boat. Bad idea when dealing with a predator, I know. But I managed to get the boat back towards the deeper water as it stopped at chest-level water like the night before. The animal watched me, its eyes burning with an intense fury that I have never seen in an animal before. It ran back to shore and turned, and began swiping at the ground with its paws. When I saw the claws, I dreaded to think what injuries they would be capable of inflicting on me. I reached down to grab the paddle, only to find it gone. I looked up to see it laying on the pebbly surface of the shoreline. I began to cry. I was typically not an emotional person at the time, but here I could do nothing but bawl my eyes out. I was absolutely terrified. I looked around, and I saw what appeared to be a branch from a dead tree jutting out of the water not far from shore, but seemingly far enough away the animal wouldn't reach me unless it was very determined. I used my hands to clumsily steer the boat towards it, and could see the creature lumbering along the shoreline, following me. I screamed at it to go away, but the animal was unfazed by my shouts and screams. When I reached the branch, I looked up and saw that the animal was gone. I looked around the shoreline. I wasn't terribly far from where my campsite had been, and I didn't see any trace of the creature. I accidentally kicked my foot back and heard a thud. I froze, and again I heard the crashing and snapping of branches in the thicket. I pushed the boat away from the log and back towards the deeper water. The creature again appeared on the shoreline and let out a horrendous-sounding roar. I never heard an animal sound like that before. It was such an awful roar that I flinched in fear. I bent over and clamped my hands around my ears. I was doing everything to keep the image and sound of that animal out of my head. I was cold, wet, and alone in the Alaskan wilderness, and I was being terrorized by something that was an indescribable approximation of a bear. I heard my foot thud again, and I felt around, at first thinking it was part of the boat. I felt a handle, and out from under my seat was a metal box with a padlock on it that wasn't even locked. I carefully took off the padlock and opened the box, and inside was a vintage camping shovel, looked to be military surplus. It wasn't perfect, but the closest alternative to a paddle. I slowly began heading down the lake towards a river. I looked over my shoulder and the creature was continuing to follow me. I had never seen an animal this intent before. My mind was racing through so many thoughts. Was it an animal? A monster? I reached into my pack and pulled out the satellite phone. Battery still had enough juice, and I immediately called Mark and, despite my sobbing voice and him trying to calm me down, said he'd get out to me as soon as he can, and told me to keep an eye on the creature. Mark believed I was being stalked by a bear. Once again the sun began to dip down, and I was enveloped in darkness as clouds started to block out the moon. Somehow I was able to fall asleep. Woke up once in the middle of the night, thinking the animal had gotten to me, but, after an excruciatingly long period of silence, waved it off as a fish. When dawn came, I found my boat started to drift towards shore. I looked around, didn't see any sign of the animal. I gathered my remaining belongings, and after looking for landmarks that Mark advised me on, trekked to where he was going to meet me at. That was the scariest 3 hours of my life. All I could think of was that animal stalking me. I completely forgot to even be aware of other animals like moose. As I crested a hilltop, I could see Mark's plane in a flat meadow, and I just booked it for the plane as fast as I was able to. Mark rushed over and helped with my belongings, a rifle slung over his shoulder. Once again, I heard the familiar crashing sound of something in the brush near the hill I was on, and Mark readied his rifle as I got into the plane. We both saw the animal rear up on its hind legs and roar at us. Again, the way it was postured was so different from how a bear stands up. Mark quickly hopped in the plane just as the animal charged. However, Mark was able to get his plane airborne long before the animal could reach us, and I only caught one last glimpse of it before it fled back into the brush. I asked Mark what was wrong with that bear, and he just replied, his voice shaking, something I had never seen the 61-year-old man do in the time I knew him. I don't know what that was, but that wasn't a fucking bear. After we reached civilization, Mark swore he would never bring anyone to that area again, and I would be his first and last camper flight. I think we both regret the inexperience. Alaska Fish and Game were notified of the situation, but when they investigated the scene, they found only the remains of the campsite and some of my gear. They did recover some items that were still usable, but unfortunately, due to heavy rainstorms a few days after the incident, they could not find any footprints or even fur of the creature, officially. It was logged as a bear incident. And with Mark explaining that the region wasn't particularly a prime area for excursions, Fish and Game decided there was no need to look into it further. Mark and I are the only ones to have seen this creature, and unfortunately, neither of us were able to describe the animal to Fish and Wildlife, because both of us would break down into tears before we could get far enough into the description. When I came back to the continental US, I went through a few years of therapy, mostly video calls due to COVID, but after things started opening back up, my therapist was taking me to zoos to see bears for exposure therapy, but it was fruitless. People thought I just had a scary encounter with a big brown bear, but I know better. There's something up there in Alaska. I don't know what it is, but I pray to God every day that someone else doesn't have a run-in with it. Sometimes the scariest stories are the ones that leave you with more questions than answers, stories that linger in your mind long after they're told, making you wonder, could this happen to me? With that said, thanks for watching, and until next time.